The Vineyard Movement revolutionized Christian worship in the 1980s. Intimate worship songs, power evangelism, signs and wonders. At their peak, over 1,500 churches in 60 countries sang Vineyard songs every Sunday. Open the eyes of my heart, breathe, Holy and Anointed One. These songs shaped a generation's worship. Vineyard didn't just create music. They created a model of church that influenced evangelicalism for 4 decades. But today, the Vineyard movement is quietly collapsing. Vineyard USA lost over 200 churches in 5 years, a documented 15% decline according to their own reports. The worship songs that define the movement are being replaced by Hillsong and Bethel. The signs and wonders emphasis that attracted thousands now feels dated to younger Christians. The movement that taught the world to worship is dying, and most Christians don't even know it's happening. Today, we're investigating the Vineyard collapse, how a movement that seemed unstoppable in the 1990s is now struggling to survive, what went wrong when everything seemed so right, and what this reveals about movements built on experience rather than structure. Subscribe now if you want to understand one of the most significant shifts in contemporary Christianity. Because the Vineyard collapse is a case study in what happens when movements fail to pass their vision to the next generation. Let me show you the documented data from Vineyard's own reports. In 2000, Vineyard USA had approximately 650 churches across America. By 2010, that number had grown to nearly 700 churches, still expanding at the height of their influence. But since 2015, the trajectory reversed dramatically. By 2020, Vineyard USA reported 600 churches. By 2024, fewer than 500 remain. That's over 200 churches lost in less than a decade. But here's what no one expected. The numbers don't tell the full story of what's happening on the ground. Many Vineyard churches that remain have dropped Vineyard from their names. They keep loose affiliation for legal reasons but no longer actively identify with the movement. Others have merged with non-Vineyard churches or gone independent. The worship music that defined Vineyard has largely disappeared from church setlists. In 2005, Vineyard worship songs regularly appeared in CCLI's Top 100. By 2024, almost none remain. Vineyard's influence on worship music, once their signature contribution, has been eclipsed by Hillsong, Bethel, and Elevation. Conference attendance has declined significantly. Regional and national Vineyard conferences that once drew thousands now attract hundreds. This isn't speculation. These are facts acknowledged by Vineyard leaders themselves. Mark led worship at a Vineyard church in Southern California for 15 years. He loved the intimacy of Vineyard worship, the simplicity of the songs, the focus on encountering God's presence. He'd been to Vineyard conferences where worship lasted hours, where the Holy Spirit's presence felt tangible, where he learned to lead worship that touched people's hearts. But by 2018, something had changed. Mark told me, "I started noticing that young people in our church didn't connect with Vineyard songs anymore. They wanted Hillsong and Bethel. They'd never heard of Breathe or Holy and Anointed One. To them, those songs felt old. I tried to explain that Vineyard pioneered this kind of worship, that we did it first, but they didn't care about history. They wanted what felt current, and Vineyard didn't feel current anymore." In 2020, Mark's church dropped Vineyard from its name. They became independent. They still sang intimate worship songs, but they were Hillsong and Bethel songs, not Vineyard. Mark said, "I felt like I was watching my spiritual heritage disappear, but I couldn't stop it. The next generation just moved on." To understand what's collapsing, you need to know what Vineyard was. The Vineyard movement was founded by John Wimber in the late 1970s. Wimber was a former Righteous Brothers keyboardist who became a pastor. His vision combined several revolutionary elements. First, worship as intimate encounter with God rather than performance. Vineyard pioneered the worship set model, 20 to 30 minutes of continuous songs leading people into God's presence. Their songs were simple, singable, focused on intimacy with Jesus. Second, power evangelism, the belief that signs, wonders, and healing should accompany gospel proclamation. Wimber believed evangelicals had lost the supernatural dimension of Christianity. Vineyard churches expected God to heal the sick, cast out demons, manifest his presence tangibly. Third, a relaxed, non-religious culture that felt accessible to seekers. No suits, no formality, no religious jargon. Pastors wore jeans and led worship with acoustic guitars. Fourth, small group discipleship as the core of church life. Wimber believed transformation happened in homes, not just sanctuaries. This vision attracted thousands in the 1980s and 90s. Vineyard churches multiplied across America and globally. John Wimber became one of the most influential leaders in evangelicalism. But Wimber died in 1997 at age 63, and this is where things started to unravel. The movement he founded has struggled to sustain his vision without his leadership. Subscribe now if you're seeing that even successful movements contain seeds of their own decline. The first major problem was Vineyard's failure to replace Wimber's leadership. Wimber wasn't just a leader. He was the living embodiment of Vineyard's vision. His personality and relationships held the movement together. When he died, Vineyard lost more than a leader. They lost the person who defined what Vineyard meant. And here's what made this devastating. Wimber built Vineyard with minimal hierarchy. Everything was relational rather than institutional. This worked while Wimber lived, but it created succession chaos after his death. Vineyard USA went through several national directors in the decade after Wimber died. Each leader brought different priorities. Each had different visions. Regional leaders felt increasingly disconnected from national leadership. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Wimber's vision was deeply personal and intuitive. He led by presence, relationship, and modeling, not by creating reproducible systems. When he died, Vineyard lost the person who embodied the vision. But they hadn't institutionalized it in ways that could outlive him. Younger leaders didn't have Wimber's authority or relational capital. Churches that joined because of Wimber felt less connected to successors they didn't know. The result was increasing fragmentation. Vineyard churches operated more independently with less movement cohesion. This made Vineyard vulnerable to every other problem that would follow. And what happened next shocked the entire movement. In 1994, unusual manifestations began at Toronto Airport Vineyard. Prolonged laughter, animal sounds, people falling and shaking. The phenomena attracted worldwide attention. Thousands traveled to Toronto to experience the revival. Wimber initially supported it. He saw it as consistent with Vineyard's openness to the Holy Spirit. But as the manifestations became more extreme, Wimber grew concerned. This is where things got worse. By 1995, theological tensions developed between Wimber and Toronto pastor John Arnott. The controversy centered on whether the manifestations were genuinely from the Holy Spirit, or potentially fleshly or demonic. It involved questions about how to pastor people experiencing intense spiritual phenomena. In December 1995, Wimber made a difficult decision. He removed Toronto Airport Vineyard from the Vineyard Movement. The church left and continued independently, but the damage was done. The controversy created deep divisions within Vineyard. Some churches left in support of Toronto, feeling Wimber had quenched the spirit. Others left because they felt Vineyard hadn't addressed the controversy strongly enough. The debate consumed enormous energy. It damaged Vineyard's reputation among evangelicals who viewed Toronto skeptically. Most importantly, it revealed something dangerous. Vineyard's emphasis on supernatural experience created theological vulnerabilities. When experiences became extreme or questionable, the movement didn't have strong theological frameworks to evaluate them. This left individual churches making their own judgments without clear movement-wide discernment. The Toronto blessing weakened Vineyard just as it was navigating leadership transition. Pastor David planted a Vineyard church in Colorado in 1998. He believed deeply in Wimber's vision: intimate worship, power evangelism, casual, accessible culture. For 12 years, his church thrived. They grew to 300 members. They planted 2 daughter churches. David loved being part of Vineyard. But by 2010, David was struggling. He told me, After Wimber died and Toronto split us, Vineyard felt directionless. Every regional conference had different messages about what Vineyard should be. National leadership kept changing. I'd ask for help with church planting support or pastoral training, and there wasn't capacity to help. I felt abandoned. In 2012, David's church left Vineyard and became independent. He said, "It broke my heart. I loved Vineyard, but I realized I was paying denominational dues for almost no benefits. The relational connection was gone. The vision was unclear. Other church planting networks offered way more support, coaching, funding, training. Vineyard couldn't compete. Today, David's church thrives as an independent congregation. They still practice intimate worship and small group discipleship, Vineyard's legacy. But they're no longer officially Vineyard. David said, "Vineyard taught me how to do church. I'll always be grateful, but the movement couldn't give me what I needed to keep growing." The third major problem was that Vineyard lost worship music dominance. Vineyard pioneered intimate, spirit-led worship in the 1980s and 90s. Their songs defined contemporary worship for a generation. But by the mid-2000s, Hillsong from Australia began dominating. Higher production values, more radio-friendly songs, better marketing. Bethel music from California emerged in the 2010s. Similar intimate worship but more charismatic emphasis. By 2015, Hillsong and Bethel had almost completely displaced Vineyard. Churches that once sang primarily Vineyard songs now sang Hillsong and Bethel. And this mistake changed everything. Worship music was Vineyard's primary influence mechanism. Their songs spread their theology and culture to non-Vineyard churches. When churches stopped singing Vineyard songs, they stopped absorbing Vineyard's DNA. The intimacy and Holy Spirit focus continued through Hillsong and Bethel, but without Vineyard branding. Younger worship leaders grew up singing Hillsong and Bethel, not Vineyard. They had no connection to or awareness of Vineyard's pioneering role. Vineyard churches themselves often sang more Hillsong and Bethel than Vineyard songs. But here's what shocked researchers. Without worship music as a recruitment tool, Vineyard lost visibility entirely. Churches that might have joined Vineyard because they loved the worship never discovered Vineyard existed. The loss of worship music dominance was both symptom and cause of broader decline. Vineyard had pioneered contemporary worship but couldn't maintain leadership when the market shifted. The fourth major problem was Vineyard's failure to connect with millennials and Gen Z. Vineyard's culture resonated powerfully with boomers and Gen X in the 1980s, 90s. The casual, non-religious vibe was countercultural and attractive. The worship style and supernatural emphasis met spiritual hunger. But by the 2010s, what felt fresh to boomers felt dated to younger generations. The Vineyard aesthetic, acoustic guitars, simple songs, emphasis on feeling God's presence, had become mainstream. Younger generations experienced that style as normal rather than revolutionary. It lost distinctiveness. And this is where things get worse. Vineyard's supernatural emphasis, once attractive, now felt awkward. Younger Christians shaped by scientific skepticism and progressive culture found signs and wonders' emphasis embarrassing. They wanted social justice, not just spiritual experiences. But here's the part that reveals everything. Vineyard emphasized experience over theological education. This worked for boomers and Gen X who came from traditional church backgrounds with theological grounding. But millennials and Gen Z increasingly came from non-church backgrounds. They didn't have theological foundation. Vineyard's experiential approach didn't provide the structure they needed. They experienced Vineyard as theologically shallow. Vineyard also struggled with social justice concerns central to millennial and Gen Z faith. The movement's focus on worship and supernatural ministry didn't engage racial justice or poverty. These generations prioritized those issues. Attempts to adapt felt forced because social justice hadn't been part of Vineyard's DNA. The result was younger Christians visiting but not staying. They appreciated the worship but didn't find compelling reasons to join. Emma grew up in a Vineyard church in the Pacific Northwest. She was baptized there, went to youth group, loved the intimate worship. But when she went to college in 2019, everything changed. Emma told me, "I visited my Vineyard church when I came home for Christmas, and it felt old. The worship was the same acoustic guitar style I'd grown up with, but my friends at college were singing Hillsong and Bethel. Those felt more current, more produced, more exciting. Vineyard felt like my parents' worship. But it wasn't just the music." Emma said, "My college friends talked about racial justice, climate change, poverty. They were doing ministry that addressed those issues. When I asked my Vineyard pastor about those things, he said they focused on worship and spiritual gifts. That felt irrelevant. Like, I care about encountering God, but I also care about justice." Vineyard only seemed to care about the spiritual stuff. In 2023, Emma joined a non-denominational church plant in her college town. They sing contemporary worship. They do racial reconciliation work. They address social issues. Emma said, "I don't have anything against Vineyard, but it doesn't speak my language. It's not addressing what I care about. I feel bad because I know my parents' generation loves it, but I just don't connect." Emma's story represents thousands of young people raised Vineyard who quietly left. Today, Vineyard USA exists with significantly diminished size and influence. Fewer than 500 churches remain affiliated according to their directory. Many have aging congregations and struggle financially. Church planting has slowed dramatically. Few new Vineyard churches are launching. Regional differences exist. The Midwest and West Coast retain more churches. But in many regions, Vineyard presence has disappeared entirely. But what happened next was unexpected. The movement's influence on broader evangelicalism has faded significantly. Younger pastors and Christians often have little awareness of Vineyard. What influence remains is indirect. Worship culture Vineyard pioneered is now mainstream. But without Vineyard attribution, Vineyard leaders acknowledge the decline openly. They describe a season of re-examining identity and mission. There's discussion of focusing on church planting and revitalization. Some leaders emphasize returning to Vineyard's roots: worship, power evangelism, relational culture. Others argue Vineyard must evolve to address contemporary concerns. These different visions create ongoing tension about direction. What's clear is that Vineyard is in a significant transitional moment, seeking a sustainable path forward. Understanding departures reveals Vineyard's challenges. Some churches left because they felt Vineyard had lost its way theologically. They wanted Vineyard's original emphasis on worship and supernatural ministry, but felt the national movement had moved away. These churches often became independent or joined networks emphasizing similar values. Other churches left because they found other affiliations more attractive. Some joined Bethel-affiliated networks, drawn by more charismatic emphasis. Others affiliated with church-planting networks offering better support and resources. Some simply became independent, concluding denominational affiliation wasn't valuable. Financial considerations played a role. Vineyard affiliation involves financial commitments. Churches struggling financially couldn't afford denominational dues for limited benefits. But here's what's particularly telling. Many departing churches retained Vineyard's worship style and ministry culture. They valued what Vineyard taught them, but no longer valued formal Vineyard affiliation. The movement's cultural influence outlasted organizational loyalty. This reveals Vineyard's impact was in shaping church culture rather than building institutional loyalty. Despite Vineyard's decline, several contributions remain valuable and influential. First, Vineyard pioneered intimate, spirit-led worship that shaped contemporary worship globally. The worship culture in countless evangelical churches today reflects Vineyard's influence. Even when they don't know Vineyard's history, songs like "Open the Eyes of My Heart" continue being sung. Second, Vineyard modeled a casual, non-religious church culture. The relaxed, come-as-you-are atmosphere now common in contemporary churches owes much to Vineyard. This helped remove barriers for people who found traditional church alienating. Third, Vineyard's emphasis on small groups influenced countless churches. The cell group movement and small group focus reflect Vineyard's modeling. Fourth, Vineyard's power evangelism teaching encouraged evangelicals to expect healing and supernatural manifestations. While controversial, this emphasis pushed evangelicals toward openness to God's supernatural work. These contributions have lasting value regardless of Vineyard's institutional health. The question is whether Vineyard as an organization can find renewed purpose, or whether its influence will be entirely through historical contributions. The organizational future remains uncertain. What can Christians learn from Vineyard's collapse? Several important lessons emerge. First, movements built primarily on founders' vision struggle when that founder is gone. Wimber's death left a leadership vacuum Vineyard never filled. Healthy movements must institutionalize vision beyond the founder's lifetime. This doesn't mean becoming bureaucratic. It means creating structures that carry vision forward. Second, experiential movements need strong theological frameworks. Without clear theology, churches can't discern between genuine spiritual experience and deception. Vineyard's strength in worship needed complementary strength in theological reflection. Third, worship music influence alone can't sustain a movement when trends shift. Vineyard built significant influence through music, but hadn't developed other distinctive strengths. When musical leadership shifted, the movement had nothing else to sustain it. Fourth, movements must pass vision to new generations or they die. What resonated with boomers and Gen X didn't connect with millennials and Gen Z. Adaptation isn't compromise, it's faithful contextualization of timeless truths. Fifth, institutional weakness that seems freeing initially becomes vulnerability over time. Some structure and institutional capacity are necessary for long-term health. The question is finding the right balance. Finally, movements must distinguish between core mission and cultural forms. Vineyard's core mission, helping people encounter God, remains biblically valid, but the specific forms from the 1980s don't necessarily serve that mission in the 2020s. Successful movements adapt forms while maintaining mission. This is the wisdom Vineyard's collapse teaches, and the challenge every movement faces. The Vineyard Movement revolutionized Christian worship in the 1980s. Intimate worship, power evangelism, signs and wonders. At their peak, 1,500 churches in 60 countries. Today, Vineyard has lost over 200 churches in 5 years. The movement that shaped contemporary worship is quietly collapsing. This isn't about criticizing faithful people serving in Vineyard churches. Many continue doing excellent ministry. It's about understanding how movements decline, when founder transitions fail, when theological frameworks prove inadequate, when worship music influence shifts, when generational connections break. John Wimber's vision profoundly influenced contemporary Christianity. The worship culture and ministry model he pioneered continue blessing millions. That's significant impact even as the organization declines. But Vineyard's collapse warns about movement fragility. When vision depends too heavily on founder personality. When experience isn't anchored in robust theology. When single strengths dominate. When generational transmission fails. These aren't just Vineyard's problems. They're challenges many movements face. If this investigation helped you understand movement dynamics, subscribe now. Share with church leaders, ministry students, anyone studying how movements live or die. The Vineyard collapse isn't the end of their story. Some churches thrive. New plants launch. The movement seeks renewed direction. But understanding why they've struggled helps all of us build more sustainably. What happened to the movement that revolutionized worship? They influenced Christianity profoundly but struggled to sustain organizational strength. They shaped worship culture but lost worship music dominance. They pioneered church culture but couldn't connect with new generations. The movement that taught us to worship intimately now teaches us about movement fragility. May we learn both lessons well. The Vineyard Movement isn't dead, but it's struggling. Whether renewal comes depends on choices Vineyard leaders make now. The movement that revolutionized worship once might need revolutionary change itself to have a vital future. Only time will tell if that transformation happens.